Good afternoon. Welcome to the Carbon Market Institute's 2020 virtual seminar series on participating in Australia's carbon markets to meet corporate climate goals. I'm your host today, Brad Kerrin, the General Manager at the Carbon Market Institute, and I'm pleased to host this event with three speakers today. We're very delighted to have with us Gillian Main from the Queensland Land Restoration Fund, Dr. Kathy Waters from the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries, and Gloria Carrascos, my colleague here at CMI. Today we're looking at the second part of our focus on the states and territories in Australia, looking at the market opportunities, particularly in Queensland and New South Wales. I'd like to, I guess, just firstly give you an impression or an idea of where we've been in this series and where we're going to go. Particularly, we've looked at a high level at the international market developments. We've looked at the supply and demand dynamics in the domestic market. And as I mentioned last week, we looked at Western Australia, Victoria, and South Australia. Today, we'll look at Queensland and New South Wales, and then next week, go on to the market supply and Australia's carbon farming industry, taking a deeper look at carbon project development and hearing from some of the developers about what's happening out on the ground. I'll come back to the second series towards the end of the session and give a bit more information about some of the sessions we'll do in the break between the two series. I'd like to, I guess, get straight into it and hand over to my colleague Gloria to provide an overview generally about the state activities. Gloria, over to you.
Great, thanks, Brad. Just following on from last week's state session, as Brad mentioned, today we're going to focus on the states of Queensland and New South Wales. I wanted to start off by sharing some background information on some of the state schemes and initiatives in both these states, as well as some key emission statistics and some of the latest data from the ERF. So hopefully, as you can see now on the state, we've got Queensland and New South Wales. As mentioned, at all the state levels have committed to an emissions reduction target here in Australia of net zero by 2050, ACT doing that by 2045. Some of these are aspirational, others have been legislated. And now, according to the Climate Change Authority's recent report from earlier in March 2018, the updated Climate Policy Toolkit for Australia, if each of these state targets are achieved, we would actually see Australia's national emissions approach net zero by 2050. That's great. Now, seeing these two states here side by side would have been a perfect time for me to say something about the Blues and the Maroons, but would have revealed my woeful NRL knowledge, and as a true Victorian and AFL devotee, I will move right along. So New South Wales announced their target in 2016. Queensland's followed thereafter in 2017. And on the next few slides, I'm going to touch on some aspects of the climate policies and programs in each of these two states. So let's start off now with Queensland. As you can see here and mentioned, net zero emissions were announced in 2017 as part of the Queensland Climate Transition Strategy. They've also set an interim 2030 target of 30% reduction in emissions below 2005 levels. And they also have a renewables target of 50% renewable energy generation by 2030. So the Queensland Climate Transition Strategy set out a two-stage process, the first involving decarbonising the energy sector and developing the state's carbon sink capacity and driving innovation. The second is the implementation of policy measures. And some other Queensland Government initiatives and actions that form part of Queensland's response to climate change include support and innovation for transitioning to low and zero carbon technologies. Some parts of this initiative include things like a $2 billion green bond issued by the QTC, the Queensland Treasury Corporation. These are for projects with environmental benefits within the state of Queensland, for example, renewable energy projects, low carbon transport and water infrastructure. And that 2020 Green Bond annual report is actually online. You can have a look at that now, listing the bond issuances against a selection of eligible projects and assets. Another couple of initiatives in Queensland, interesting to note, the Energy Lab, which is a clean tech startup accelerator, helping to grow clean energy businesses and strengthen early stage commercialisation. And also a Circular Economy Lab, which is a $150,000 investment supporting businesses to change the way they think about materials, resources and waste. And I think at the moment there's a group of businesses coming together to design 5 circular economy pilot projects. And of course, the Land Restoration Fund, one of the main initiatives coming out of Queensland recently, launched in 2017, a $500 million program to expand carbon farming and really focus on land sector projects that deliver environmental, social and economic and other co-benefits. And Gillian Main will talk more to that initiative shortly. Just looking at the state statistics here in Queensland, it is the largest state contributor to our emissions, representing 32% of Australia's emissions. However, it's also currently the largest state, or the state with the largest volume of contracted abatement under the Emissions Reduction Fund. And I'll touch a little bit more on those stats later on. So moving across now to New South Wales, as I mentioned, their net zero target was announced in 2016, and they also have an interim 2030 target. Theirs is 35% below 2005 levels. New South Wales' net zero plan really lays the foundation for action on climate change and their goal to reach net zero by 2050. The government's also established a climate change fund of $1.4 billion. Amongst many things under this fund sits a climate change research strategy, which is managed by the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries, and that's really to support primary industries adapt to climate change. And it includes three key areas that it's focusing on: energy, carbon opportunities and climate resilience. There's quite a few projects under each of those thematic areas, for example, identifying feasible options for emissions reductions, as well as opportunities for accessing carbon markets. And separate to this, earlier this year, the New South Wales Government signed a Memorandum of Understanding with the Commonwealth to jointly fund $2 billion in energy and emissions reduction initiatives. So this is in addition to the energy sector. The MOU would support initiatives to reduce emissions also in non-electricity sectors. So farmers, businesses, land managers, helping them take practical, low-cost abatement actions, as well as an emissions intensity reduction program. And that's really to support large New South Wales sources of emissions to transition their plant and equipment and other assets to emissions alternatives. There's also a clean tech program in there to research, develop and commercialise emissions reduction technologies and establish a clean technology hub in New South Wales. So a number of things going on there in that net zero pathway. And Kathy, who's here from the New South Wales DPI, will talk more to that research program, which she's very much a part of, as well as other elements of the New South Wales net zero plan shortly. So just on ERF in New South Wales, the Emissions Reduction Fund, the state actually has the largest number of projects registered under the fund. And to date, New South Wales has also had the most ACCUs, or Australian Carbon Credit Units, issued in the state to projects that are under the ERF. So if we want to take a look now just at the spread of some ERF land-based projects around the country, it's clear that a lot of activity, if we're looking at the map here, is occurring in New South Wales and Queensland. Of course, in the top end as well, with a lot of savanna burning projects. And last week we spoke more about the projects within Western Australia as well. So here, thank you to the CER for providing this, is a map that looks at the three main categories of land-based projects under the ERF. So vegetation, things like plantings, reforestation, avoided clearing, farm forestry, agriculture, so things like soil carbon, cattle, dairy and other piggery methods, and of course savanna burning, which I mentioned. So it's quite interesting to note the role of regional Australia when it comes to emissions abatement across the country. If we look back at the CER's most recent quarterly carbon market report, abatement in regional areas represents a really significant proportion of emission reductions in Australia, largely due to the fact that these regions are more attractive geographically for large renewable projects and large land-based ERF projects. Also, the population density in cities compared to regional areas often makes it difficult for us to do those activities here in the city centres. So in 2019, just last year, over 50% of all abatement in Australia came from 10 regional areas. And that was, New South Wales and Queensland really dominated those lists. So that's inclusive of ERF projects as well as large-scale renewables, and to some extent some small-scale renewables like rooftop solar. So in a recent trend, and you'll see coming up here on the next slide, we've highlighted this in previous seminars as part of this series, but there has been an uptick in new method registrations under the ERF, particularly as compared to last year. So we find ourselves here halfway through the year. We've already got 43 new projects registered under the ERF, which is already more than that, which was seen in all of 2019. You can see again here, fittingly for this session, Queensland and New South Wales are leading the way in terms of the projects registered under the ERF. Also interesting to note is the method diversity we're seeing. So we're getting more energy efficiency, more waste projects coming on board. That's in addition to the more established group of methods under agriculture and vegetation. It's quite interesting to see. So I'll just wrap here with a final chart for today. Just wanted to look a little bit about the ERF contracted abatement at the moment. So just looking out into the future and highlighting some of the value of projects under the ERF that have been contracted across the states. So that's those ERF projects that are connected to a carbon abatement contract, or CAC, as people in the industry like to call them. So you can see, once again, Queensland and New South Wales here really leading the way in terms of ERF activity across the states. In Queensland, in the top chart, you can see here the total contracted volume of abatement is over 80 million tonnes of carbon, and those projects collectively have an estimated value of around 970 million. In New South Wales, the contracted volume is over 65 million and tonnes of carbon, and those have an estimated value of around $780 million. So it's quite a significant amount of investment, and just really highlights the opportunity in these regions. And with those new project registrations I shared earlier, it'll be really interesting to see the results of the CER's 11th ERF auction, which is being held later this year on the 9th and 10th of September. So just a reminder to any new projects out there, if you're looking to participate in this forthcoming auction, applications and registration close on the 28th of July, which is just a couple of weeks away. So I'll leave it there for now. As always, thanks to the CMI for their support behind the scenes on this, my team doing well, and the CER for helping out with the data. So I'll hand back to you now, Brad, and we can move on to our two main speakers for today. So hopefully that's been a nice little summary of what's going on around the states.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Gloria. It's good to hear about those net zero plans and strategies, and the range of energy technology funding and carbon farming related emissions reduction activities that are happening across both states. Look, we'll go now to Gillian Main, who's the Director of the Land Restoration Fund in Queensland. And it's been a pleasure for us here at CMI to watch the development of the Land Restoration Fund over the last few years, and particularly to see some of the great strides forward that you've been making in 2020. Gillian, hand over to you now.
Thanks, Brad. Thank you also to CMI for organising these webinars. It's really great for anybody who's working in the carbon market to be able to share information, such an emerging space, and so being able to share information and ideas is really important. So I'd just like to start today by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which we're meeting, or the many lands in which we're meeting today, and pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. So the Queensland Land Restoration Fund has been operating, or is based on the commitment from the Palaszczuk government in 2017 as an election commitment to establish a fund that was developed to develop the carbon market in Queensland. So today I'll just run you through some of the background and history of the LRF, what we're trying to achieve, how we're supporting the market, and our research and innovation. We have a very large body of work that we're delivering, and it crosses the full spectrum of this work. Today I'll only really be able to give you an overview or a high level insight to what we're doing, but you can certainly find more information on our website or contact us directly. So, as mentioned, the Queensland Department of Environment is delivering the Land Restoration Fund. It's based on a commitment from the Labor government, incoming Labor government in 2017, and was backed up in 2018 with a flagship a development of flagship $500 million land restoration fund. So the aims of the Land Restoration Fund are to facilitate a pipeline of qualifying Queensland-based carbon offset projects, to pursue environmental, social and economic co-benefits as defined by the government, and to support research and development into emerging areas where Queensland has a competitive advantage for the purpose of establishing eligibility for attaining Australian carbon credits and with co-benefits. So that's the high level overview. What we've been doing in the last 12 months is actually putting that into operation. So we know that Queensland carbon farming is already going ahead, and just like Gloria gave us with the statistics just a minute ago. But the market's also limited in all but a few locations and uses predominantly only two methods: savanna burning and human-induced regeneration. We know that Queensland has a lot more to offer to the carbon farming market and the industry in general. So Carbon farming presents an opportunity for Queensland to take advantage of our extensive natural resources to diversify income streams, create jobs and protect the environment. The statistics that have been developed indicate that there's a very large industry to be grown from anywhere between 1.4 million to 1.4 billion to 4.7 billion to be generated. That's obviously dependent on a whole range of conditions coming forward and the Commonwealth structure. But I think what we do know is that it's the natural attributes of the landscape in Queensland that provides a natural advantage to us. And so developing that industry is very important. So we also know that the carbon farming will help move Queensland closer to our target of reducing carbon emissions by at least 30% on 2005 levels by 2030 and reaching our target of net zero emissions by 2050. What we also know is that carbon farming projects deliver other highly valued benefits, including the adoption of innovative farming methods, driving new and diversified income streams, the growth of new industries, job creation, and a healthier environment, including improved waterways, best habitat for threatened species, and more resilient landscapes. Apologies. So we started this journey in 2017, and one of the highlights for us has been it's been working in the commercial space. So we've been establishing our pipeline of qualifying carbon offset projects. So we have a mandate to work across more than just investing in projects. We operate on two fronts. One is the industry development front and one is the commercial front. And today, so I'll just run through briefly today the work that we're doing in each of those segments. The carbon market in Australia, for those who aren't aware, is underpinned by the Australian Carbon Credit Unit, which is a financial instrument created by the Carbon Farming Initiative Act of 2011. That's the Commonwealth framework that we work within. The LRF takes advantage of that framework to then leapfrog into new and higher level markets. So at the moment, the main demand for ACCUs comes from governments. From the Commonwealth Government in particular, and more recently from the Queensland Government. But increasingly businesses are seeking to purchase ACCUs to offset their emissions. So the Queensland Government has recognised the opportunity to leverage the carbon market and invest in the voluntary market to incentivise landholders to restore the natural attributes of Queensland landscapes, resulting in improved environmental, economic and social outcomes. The LRF is investing in projects that generate ACCUs and are offering to buy those ACCUs that are voluntary in the voluntary market at a fixed price. But that's not what we're doing. So we're not just buying ACCUs, we're not just buying any ACCUs. We also know, as I stated before, that carbon farming projects deliver other highly valued benefits. The adoption of innovative farming methods, driving new diversified income streams, the growth of new industries, job creation as a result of increasing productivity from land and healthier environment. So what we're doing is aiming to invest in projects that capture these benefits and to value and pay for those benefits that are a priority to Queensland. So we're not just paying for the ACCU price in the standard ACCU market, we're also paying for the premium of the co-benefit. So we talk about these a lot, so you hear me repeat this over and over again, is that we're looking at the environmental, social and economic impacts of carbon farming and valuing those. So environmentally, we're improving biodiversity, habitat for threatened species. Economically, we're increasing resilience and strength of regional communities. And socially, we're supporting diverse and vibrant communities, and we work a lot with traditional owner groups to bring forward their carbon farming projects. So some of the examples that we see and value in carbon farming projects, in particular in Queensland, are better water quality flowing into the Great Barrier Reef, enhanced habitat regrowth for threatened species such as glossy black cockatoos and koalas and cassowaries, and new income streams for Queenslanders staying in rural communities, and that's becoming increasingly more important in this current economic climate. So when we put that together, what we end up with what we call an LRF premium carbon credit. So we support projects that bring forward Australian carbon credits, and we add the co-benefit premium to that. And so when we invest through the Land Restoration Fund Trust, and these are the types of projects that we are investing in. They must be able to generate ACCUs, so we're not interested in projects that don't deliver ACCUs, but most importantly is we're looking at prioritising projects that deliver these co-benefits. So the second part of our work is investing in the industry development. So we think of it very much as two buckets of work, but they're intrinsically linked. The industry development allows projects to come forward more readily into the trust, and then the trust projects can help feed information back to our industry development. So we work across in the areas of education, in market mechanics such as method development, in research and innovation. And I'll just give you a quick overview now of some of the things that we've been doing in those spaces in the last 12 months. So we started with in sort of building the market well before we started investing in the market. We've already demonstrated a commitment to the carbon market by investing in relationships with key market players such as the Carbon Market Institute, Accounting for Nature, Queensland Farmers Federation and AgForce. We partner with other research groups as well in order to move forward some of the research that's needed to underpin the markets. We can see here that we completed a survey of 800 Queensland landholders to test their understanding of carbon farming, and that's given us really valuable insight into the knowledge and understanding of carbon farming. And we understand that that the carbon market has a long way to go. So we don't. So the education is a really key part of what we need to do. So in 2019, we started on our journey of innovation by committing money to, sorry, I'm just having trouble getting this slide to move forward. So we invested in $5 million in 12 pilot projects. So an important part of the pilot program approach is the knowledge that we can gain from opportunities that Queensland can leverage to build our economy and improve our environment through carbon farming. So we've invested in 12 pilot projects, 6 through the Kickstarting the Market program, aimed at building future participation in the market, and 6 through the Catalysing Action program, which are pilot projects that demonstrate the delivery of carbon abatement and measurable co-benefits in action. Some of the highlights of the projects that we've been working on include working with CSIRO on environmental outcomes from savanna burning, and working with G'dāgal and Green Collar to use traditional mosaic fire stick farming practices to control native species as part of the human-induced regeneration method. And we've been working with Meat and Livestock Australia to method to market project, developing evidence to support market participation, particularly for the beef industry producers, by valuing natural capital in grazing systems. We use these as case studies and ideas for method improvement. The real benefits for LRF in the pilot projects are the data that underpins the better development of co-benefit standard and identifying new ways of working through barriers to entry to the carbon market. So we've also been trying to grow the market by providing education to Queensland land managers. We know that they're extremely sophisticated in the way they manage their land, and that they're looking for new ways to diversify their income and to reduce risk and to become more sustainable in the future. There are many avenues for land managers wanting to participate in carbon farming market. The LRF is seeking to engage and support those who enter the carbon farming market, and also to support those groups that support land managers. So we do that through, we recognise that there's been a shortage of advisors in the carbon farming space, particularly those who have specific skill and knowledge to be able to support the carbon farming project development. There is a very healthy project advisor network that the Carbon Market Institute supports, but we recognise that there are individual landholders who may want to get information and advice from people like from people such as their own own accountant or legal advisor. And so we've been trying to work to ways to upskill them. So we've developed a knowledge hub that provides online tools for them to be able to go on and find out some information. And we've also established an approved advisor program. So anybody who's been onto that knowledge hub and has the required skills and professional skills in one area can apply to be an approved advisor. And that's just building the network of resources available to carbon farmers. We also have had running a rebate program, which is up to $10,000 for rebate on advice from an approved advisor. That program's currently closed while we're reviewing it, but we hope to be able to reopen that in the future. In addition, the team ran 17 workshops across Queensland, again, just trying to build the skills of the network to encourage more people to come into carbon farming. I guess probably the key area that we'll focus on in the next 12 months is in the areas of research and innovation. This is a really key part of what the Land Restoration Fund is doing. We're not doing it just to support Queensland carbon farming. This is designed to actually develop methods and support the broader carbon farming market in Australia. So two of the things that we are working on in particular, probably the highest priority for us this year, is the development of a blue carbon or coastal restoration method or methods. And we're investing in projects that deliver proof of concept to Queensland. Investment in coastal wetlands builds resilience and helps communities adapt to the increasing threats of climate change and sea level rise. This is part of the broader strategic goal to deliver a method enabling commercial blue carbon projects in Queensland. So we're working closely with the Commonwealth. We work with a range of stakeholder groups around blue carbon. It is a high priority for us. We see enormous opportunity in Queensland, and it's certainly beneficial to the Great Barrier Reef and also other key waterways. For an example of where we're investing in blue carbon is in a project called the Blue Heart. So the Blue Heart project is a collaboration project with the Sunshine Coast Council, with the Department of Environment Science and Unity Water. So what that's trying to do is demonstrate that restoring 40 hectares of tidal wetland on former cane land, that will bring forward some of the data that's needed to support carbon farming, blue carbon method in particular, and will model hydrologically the impacts of the change in the land use. We also have an interest in koala habitat restoration. It's a key focus for the Queensland Government. And so we will be working on projects that look to develop, restore koala habitat through carbon farming. It's a difficult area of work because most koala habitat is held in small land holdings. And so we're trying to develop methods for collaboration or cooperation between landholders to bring forward some of that, some of those projects. So we will be developing a pilot project in and around that.
Just a 1 minute warning, Gillian.
Oh, thank you. I'm nearly done. Thank you so much. So the last area that I'll sort of bring to your attention is, and probably a very critical one, I probably could have brought forward earlier, but is our co-benefit. So the key document that underpins our interest in co-benefits is called our co-benefit standard, so the Land Restoration Co-benefit Standard. It's the document that assures and underpins and verifies how co-benefits are delivered to us, and it's a requirement of any LRF projects that they follow that co-benefit standard. So we do realise that we need to do more work on that. So it's a very good document and it's showing a high level of robustness, but we know that there's more that we can do, and so we will be investing heavily in developing that program further. And certainly we are interested also in continuing with to develop other methods of carbon farming, including vegetation management method and nitrogen efficiency for the cane industry. So these are just some examples of how we're working to grow the carbon industry. And although we invest in Queensland, our work is designed to be applicable to carbon farming across Australia. So thanks again for Carbon Institute, Market Institute for putting this together for us today. If you'd like to know anything more about the Land Restoration Fund, you can jump onto our website. We've got lots of great resources on there. We'll be refreshing and updating that website over the next 12 months. And you can certainly email us anytime at thecarbonfarming@des.queensland.gov.au to find out more. Thanks, Brad.
Thanks very much, Gillian. That was very illuminating. Look, CMI, we see the LRF is a great market signal that supports a pipeline of new project origination and starts to shift the market signal away from just that lowest cost abatement and towards the high value projects that include co-benefits. So we look forward to seeing the ongoing investment and how the fund matures in the future. We'll now travel down to New South Wales, and I'll introduce Dr. Kathy Waters, the Principal Research Scientist and leader of their climate research work at the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries. Kathy is working hard to develop and begin implementing plans on how New South Wales could scale up and expand their carbon farming industry across the landscape and across the agricultural sector. So I'll hand over now to Kathy. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Brad. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to highlight today some research that we've been undertaking over the last 2 years, and as Gloria indicated, it's research that's been undertaken under the Climate Change Research Strategy, particularly focusing on carbon opportunities for the New South Wales agricultural sector, and looking at largely issues that revolve around how we can prioritise land for carbon and how we can have optimisation between managing land for carbon and for agricultural land use. I'm also going to introduce a little bit more detail about the Net Zero Plan, which has been implemented by the Department of Planning, Industry and Environment, and it's currently being co-developed through DPI and that department. So the Climate Research Strategy has been going for a couple of years now, as I indicated, and Gloria mentioned there are a number of projects, there's 7 projects around energy and climate resilience themes, but also one around carbon opportunities. So the research strategy is really trying to support the primary industry sector to identify and prioritise emissions reduction and sequestration opportunities, to be able to make sure we can achieve an increased return on investments for emissions reduction projects and have greater investment certainty for the sector, and to be able to understand those environmental benefits better through emissions reduction. So primary industries and agriculture, more importantly, I guess, you know, is currently responsible for being both a source of emissions but also providing significant abatement, and we've just seen that through Gloria's introduction. So this program of work really recognises that there are multiple benefits in supporting agriculture in the delivery of abatement, particularly the large, significant amount of abatement potential. But as Gillian's just pointed out, the strong linkages between sustainable land management and abatement activity and agricultural production. And that's going to allow the agricultural sector to maintain market access into the future, particularly when there's changing preferences for this increasing requirement to demonstrate sustainable land management practices and stewardship. But most importantly, carbon farming offers an additional income stream for farmers, as well as these multiple social and environmental benefits that we've just heard about in the Land Restoration Fund. So here I'm going to describe some of the ongoing work that we're doing to identify the most sort of cost-effective abatement options for farmers, And one of the first questions that we wanted to be able to answer is actually how much abatement occurs across New South Wales under the or potential abatement under the different ERF methods, and really to able to identify what these opportunities are. So here's just 4 examples of 2 methods: human-induced regeneration and environmental plantings, and the left-hand maps show where current activity is around the ERF, and the right-hand side shows what we've mapped as identified as areas that are suitable, sort of based on the ERF eligibility rules, where they lend themselves to spatial documentation, but identifying these areas that are suitable. So the bottom one for the environmental plantings is just for those temperate areas in New South Wales. So we were able to use the latest version of FullCAM that was released just a few months ago to be able to look at those estimates of carbon pools across the state under each different method. So this is an example of above ground biomass, but we've got below ground and soil carbon pools as well. And FullCAM provide these incremental growth in carbon. So for 100 years, you can have a look at how much carbon has been sequestered. So you can sort of bury down to regional levels, as it's shown on the right-hand side. But we've often had difficulty in being able to get that resolution down at a finer scale. So that's some areas that we've been working on. But using these relatively coarse estimates, we can sort of come up with sort of what we suggest are feasible abatement estimates over the next 10 years from 2020 to 2030 from agriculture in New South Wales. So these are areas that are sort of based on our suitability maps, so technically where it's suitable for those areas that lend themselves for this spatial prioritisation, but also based on very conservative adoption rates. So depending on the type of methodology, they could be between 1% and 10% adoption, but also for some of the vegetation-based sectors, how much on-farm adoption, and we've assumed about 20% on-farm adoption, so 20% of the farm is actually under carbon farming. So that gives a relative rank of some activities around existing ERF methods and some of the emissions reduction from agriculture estimates. So one thing that FullCAM doesn't do is to provide us with estimating how much carbon can be accumulated in the landscape under future climate. Now, to be able to do that, we undertook some modelling with 3PG, which is basically a physiological process-based model, and it predicts tree growth over time. And it allows you to put input climate variables in, so you can actually see how that impact of future climate on abatement potential. Obviously, we can't use this approach for soil, but we've been using it for vegetation, so all vegetation methods. We initially had to go through a sort of validation process to be able to look at how well Australian species were able to be reflected and their growth modelled through 3PG. And this gives you just an illustration of that, where we took 9 representative sites, and that's shown on the right-hand side, where we've got some really low rainfall sites with low levels of abatement, above ground biomass, and high levels for high rainfall areas. So we had fairly good agreement between the observed values and what the models were predicting. But what we needed to do then is to use those models for output for above ground biomass that came out of 3PG to look at future emissions scenarios in climate projections. So we undertook an exercise where we sort of we looked at the latest climate data from CMET6, and we downscaled using a multiple ensemble, so a number of climate global climate models, so 19 in all, to be able to understand what the effects of climate were in different locations. So I know this is a pretty horrific graph, but it just shows you for each of those 9 points. So you've got Wenaring there on the left-hand side, which is low rainfall, Burrawa high rainfall, and it shows you can have a look at this change in biomass over time. So the little dotted line represents below the line is relatively low CO2 fertilisation effect, and above the line is high CO2 fertilisation effect. So you can have a look at under different emissions and over different time periods what that change might look like. So we're able to then, this is an example of how we've been able to use that, that information for human-induced regeneration. So we use the same processes we did for the validation. So across those areas that we mapped as suitable, that 3.3 odd million hectares, we had a 1 kilometre grid and about 33,000 points where we estimated the biomass for 100 years. So a lot of computational capacity. And so this shows you the relative changes in biomass over a 30-year period, so in this case to 2030 relative to a historic baseline period. And this suggests that future climate, that there's going to be some areas where we could see a negative impact change on biomass, and some areas where we could see an increased change. So some of those more coastal areas, there's higher rainfall areas in the north of the state in particular, and some of the western areas that we're seeing a greater negative impact. So because we have these spatial layers now for the amount of what we're calling this sort of climate adjusted biomass layers, we're actually able then to put them into a land use trade-offs model. So specifically the LUTO model that was developed by CSIRO and used for such things as the National Outlook. So it's a national model for Australia, and it's an integrated environmental economics model system that provides sort of high spatial resolution and temporal resolution. And it enables that projection of the potential land use responses to environment and economic policy settings, and to quantify those environmental and economic impacts over time. So you can see that the plots shown here are for HIR again, and show that under current climate, the carbon supply will be exhausted for those areas that we've mapped as suitable for a carbon price of around $30 a tonne of CO2 equivalent. You can examine specific costing scenarios. So in this case with HIR, we're looking specifically at the amount of tree covers and pasture, where that competition between pasture and cover negatively impacts on livestock production in this case. And we can look at specific costings. In this case, we're looking at total grazing pressure costings. So then looking sort of more into the future under low emission scenarios, we can have a look at the carbon supply and how that might be exhausted under a lower price setting, in this case $25 a tonne of CO2 equivalent. I do stress this is preliminary results, this is ongoing work, and we aim to achieve or complete that work by the end of the year. But this type of land use optimisation, prioritisation mapping has real implications for being able to identify the points in which farmers may switch one land use to another land use, and to be able to incorporate carbon farming into existing activities. So even more important, it's very important for being able to identify where and how agriculture can contribute to the state's net zero plan. So I've just got the last few slides that will summarise the state's net zero plan. So for those of you that aren't aware of it, this plan is underpinned by a memorandum of understanding that was signed in January this year, and it sets out a clear long-term path for the state to be able to transition to net zero by 2050. It's going to see emissions reduction across all sectors, which includes agriculture, mining, transport, while at the same time making sure that we can improve electricity reliability and affordability across New South Wales. So there's the first stage of the program sets out how we will deliver these objectives over the next decade. So reduce emissions while improving that prosperity and quality of life in New South Wales. So we expect to see over 11.6 billion of private investment from the program, and at about 2,400 jobs across the state in tracking to net zero. So there are 4 key priority areas that are listed there, and I just want to focus on that first priority, which is the most relevant, I think, to the agricultural sector, and that's to drive this uptake of proven emissions technology. So there are a number of programs within this first key priority around reducing emissions intensity reduction and green investment, energy efficiency, organic wastes, coal innovation, and the use of electric vehicles. But most importantly, the primary industries abatement and productivity program is important for the agricultural sector. While there are touch points across each of these programs for agriculture and more broadly across primary industries in general, it is this program which is most relevant, I guess, to the carbon markets. And it's this program that we're currently in a design phase, and that's scheduled to commence early next year, 2021. So through this program, we're going to support farmers and land managers to be able to secure new income streams through carbon projects and carbon markets, and support the commercialisation and the adoption of low emissions technologies by regional and agricultural communities. So I guess if you'd like to stay in touch and get updates with new information as it comes aboard for the program, you can subscribe to this email address. And if you have any further questions, you can also contact the program designers on this email address. So their feedback and feedback, particularly for future engagement, is going to help them to design that plan.
Well, thanks very much for that, Kathy. That was really, really very interesting, and particularly that point that you made around that trade-off, that you would, for some activities, you'd need higher prices to shift the activity away from some land use towards the emission reduction activities, and the need to understand where and how to contribute. On that, I might go to you first, Kathy, on a question with that. Part of this, as you sort of said there, we need the agricultural sector to understand where and how to contribute. Do you think that, or I guess how ready do you think the regional communities are, or the ag sector is, to start engaging with this more? Is there education and outreach as a part of this process for you?
Yeah, look, and as Julian pointed out, I mean, they've looked like they've got sort of high rate of awareness. I would suggest that rate was somewhat less in some sectors in New South Wales, and that's I think largely because of the focus out far west and sort of out of sight and out of mind across the broader sector. But certainly the Rural Research and Development Corporations, particularly MLA, as Julian sort of pointed out with the Land Restoration Fund, are very much engaged, and Dairy Australia and other RDCs, even Grains Research and Development Corporation. So that necessity to be able to understand natural capital value and to be able to understand and value emissions reduction within agricultural landscapes is certainly on the agenda to be able to sort of to be able to help the industry transform and raise that awareness.
Absolutely. Well, look, we've got quite a few questions coming through. We'll try and get through as many as we can. But I note that Gillian's in there already answering some questions. So if you do want to just check through the questions in the Q&A, some of them may have already been answered. But I'll jump to one on soil carbon, and perhaps something for both Kathleen and Gillian to respond to. Are there investments in the development of cost-effective methods to measure soil organic carbon in the rangelands? And I might expand that to just asking what both New South Wales and Queensland are doing around the development of soil carbon activities, particularly for that sort of broader agricultural space. Gillian, if you have any thoughts on that first.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. So we are working in the soil carbon space, and we've certainly been working most recently in developing methods that relate to our co-benefits in particular. We understand that soil carbon, the accounting for that can be very expensive, and so it is one of our aims to invest more money into making that a more accessible method. It is quite difficult, but I do know that there are lots of different groups that are working on it, and we're certainly investing in it ourselves. I can't give you any more technical information than that. Sorry, it's not exactly my area of expertise, but we will certainly keep the market informed of what we're doing.
Kathy, any thoughts on the sort of the soil carbon?
Yeah, like it is a difficult one, I guess, like Gillian. Because of the problems with being able to measure cost effectively, we've been in the past really viewing soil carbon as a co-benefit. And for the agricultural sector, there is a lot of agreement that there are benefits of soil carbon to the agricultural production that are beyond sequestration activities. We've had a number of goes at looking at different approaches, so machine learned models to be able to benchmark soil carbon, and I know that there are a number of aggregators that are working, or a couple of aggregators that are really actively working on trying to look at alternative approaches to modify the existing ERF methods to make them more workable and more usable. And we know that the Clean Energy Regulator is also very interested in seeing how they can particularly reduce those transactional costs. But it is a problem with soil carbon, but it is a priority for agriculture.
That takes me to another question, Gillian, particularly the benchmarking idea. What do you think is the benchmark or the framework, or how does that work really to assess biodiversity and co-benefits under the LRF? You talked about that sort of broader co-benefits framework towards the end there. Is it a case of the ERF where it's really you're bringing your own story and that's being valued, or how does that work?
So the way that we're looking at it is we've provided 2 key documents to the market. So keeping in mind we've only done our first investment round, so this is an emerging space again. The way that we are valuing and assuring co-benefits is using the Land Restoration Fund co-benefit standard. It's a very key document. It's the underpinning or the method of measuring the co-benefits, and it's what gives our projects their robustness. In the same way that ACCUs have legislative methods, we're using the co-benefit standard as the underpinning or assurance of co-benefits. So we've done a lot of work on environmental co-benefits. We've got more work to do in terms of the social and economic co-benefits. But that's certainly a space where that is emerging for us. So we'd encourage people to jump on and have a look at that. We are genuinely hoping that co-benefit standard is something that we can becomes more broad and not just applicable to the Land Restoration Fund. It's important that markets become more homogenised over time, and so our aim is for it to not be just applicable to Queensland, but to have a broader application. So one of the things that we ask proponents to do is to provide advice on how they're going to assure their co-benefit standards. So they can use a third-party method. So the Accounting for Nature standard is one way of assuring co-benefits outcomes. The Aboriginal Carbon Foundation has its core benefits verification framework as well. So that's another method of being able to assure things like their social benefits and economic benefits for traditional owner projects. So hopefully that gives a flavour of the fact that it's not just about bringing your own story, it's very much about assuring and measuring outcomes.
Kathy, there's a question here about the hurdle rates that you used in your modelling for how lucrative carbon farming needs to be before you assume the adoption of that change of practice. I think you answered some of that, but I'd be interested, I guess you looked at, was speaking generally about the sort of human-induced regeneration and that sort of shift in those activities. I'd be interested if you have any thoughts on the likely cost or the advantages, or whether you've looked at that yet, on the uptake of some of those other methods that are like piggery methods or some of those more agricultural productivity or production focused activities? Have you sort of looked at the value of those?
Yeah, look, we have, as part of our emissions reduction pathways project, that's certainly been looked at. I guess the work that I sort of presented today is clearly really focused on vegetation and sequestration,
Sure.
because that's where there's there's no clarity around how much land can be converted. And that'll vary the proportion of the landscape that could be converted into carbon farming, or the proportion of landscape where it can be into carbon farming can be integrated somehow to the existing practices. So that's sort of a priority area that we're working on. I just wanted to mention something that's just following up from what Jill was saying, particularly around the co-benefits, that I think that it's really important that the jurisdictions work together, because there's an awful lot of activity around different ways of being able to value and identify co-benefits. And it'd be nice to see a more consistent and uniform approach, this sort of relates also to being able to value natural capital, which is also sort of related to the whole abatement maintenance story and these additional co-benefits.
This is probably a question for both of you. From the work that you're doing and the interaction you're having with people in the market, are there land sector activities that aren't covered by existing ERF methods that you're seeing interest from landholders? Are there new methods that need to be developed? I guess is the basis for that.
So absolutely, which is and our focus in blue carbon is absolutely being driven by demand. We see a huge benefit there. I think there probably are quite a few methods that could come forward. The issue for us is potentially where we invest first. So blue carbon is first early adopter of that. I think the other thing we've got to remember too is that it's working with the existing methods to improve them and make them more accessible. There are a lot of methods that are being used, and so, very rarely coming forward. The Land Restoration Fund premium ACCU will bring forward some of those methods because it's about price. So not every ACCU is equal in cost. To be able to produce an ACCU varies from method to method, and we're definitely seeing that in the marketplace. So working on more accessibility to existing methods is a high priority as well.
Kathy, any thoughts on that?
Look, totally agree with Gillian. There is a lot of space to move on being able to modify existing methods to increase their uptake. The only thing I would add is because of these issues around scale, if we're able to look at a whole farm method that can layer or nest different methods within the one farm, and to be able to look at alternative models for aggregation, then the amount of abatement and then these opportunities, particularly for the agricultural sector, will be amplified.
Great. Well, look, we are getting very close to time, and I might just jump across to my colleague Gloria and bring you into the discussion. We've talked very much about the development of these activities in the regions, and the supply development. But I'd be curious from your interaction with the demand side of the market, where you see, if there's any interest from corporates, that sort of voluntary market activity, whether you're seeing some of these developments or demand coming from corporates and interest in these activities.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. And there's absolutely demand coming through from the corporates, and in particular that co-benefit story, and trying to align investments in these types of projects with the company's mission and vision and sustainable development goals. It's certainly an emerging area and trend that corporates are really seeing and wanting to engage more in, either by adopting an approach whereby they do projects and invest in them themselves, or go out to the market and do it that way. So it's certainly another demand source for people to be mindful of, and one that's getting a lot of popularity lately.
Great. Well, look, thank you for that. It's certainly great to see these activities developing in Queensland and New South Wales. There's a lot of work to do, but the industry here and clearly the individuals and departments in both of these states are ready and raring to go and keen to get involved. So we look forward to the continued development of these schemes in both New South Wales and Queensland, and of course across the country, and look forward to speaking with you all in the next session as part of this series. I would like to say very much thank you to Gillian and to Kathy for joining us today and sharing with us the work that you're doing. We're very grateful for the work that you're doing and helping to open up these opportunities in the States. I'd like to just move to my final slide. So next week we'll be looking at the market supply and speaking with some project developers around the carbon farming industry nationally. And we'll also then take a break for a couple of weeks, and let me just find the details. On the 31st of July, we'll be having an Indigenous carbon conversation and explore the Indigenous carbon opportunities in Australia. We'll be speaking with the Kimberley Land Council and the Aboriginal Carbon Foundation. And then the week after, on the 7th of August, we'll be having a Kiwi carbon conversation. We'll be looking at what's happening in New Zealand, looking at their policies and the business perspectives, and we'll be joined by the New Zealand Minister for Climate Change, as well as representatives from the New Zealand Climate Commission and New Zealand carbon farming industry. After that, we'll move into series 2 of this virtual seminar series, focusing more on the carbon market strategy, trading and procurement activities, really looking at the business case for those activities, engaging in domestic carbon and energy markets, and of course looking more afield at how you can engage in international carbon markets now and in the future. So once again, thank you very much to Gillian and to Kathy and to Gloria. It's been a great session, and we look forward to having you join us next week. Thanks very much. Have a great weekend.